Evet, şimdi sıra merakla beklediğinizi düşündüğüm ilk panelimizde enflasyon hakkında konuşmalıyız. Moderatörümüz HSBC Türkiye Hazine ve Sermaye Piyasaları Genel Müdür Yardımcısı Namık Aksel ve HSBC Kıdemli Ekonomi Danışmanı Stephen King. Gerçi bütün konuşmacılarımız Stephen King hakkında size bilgiler verdi ama kendisi aynı zamanda son 15 yıl içerisinde global ekonomiye dair 4 kitap yazmış bir yazar ve bu yıl yayınlanan son kitabı da We Need to Talk About Inflation, yani enflasyon hakkında konuşmalıyız adını taşıyor. Sizi yavaş yavaş sahneye alabilirim. Bu arada let me introduce to you our panelists. HSBC Turkey Treasury and Capital Markets Deputy General Manager Namık Aksel and Stephen King. Previously chief economist and now senior economic advisor to HSB, King is a columnist for the London Evening Standard and he has authored 4 books on the global economy in the last 15 years, and his latest one, as we have mentioned, is We Need to Talk About Inflation. I would like to welcome you both and the floor is yours.
Teşekkürler. Herkese merhaba. Welcome all. We are so delighted here to be here in front of such a distinguished audience. So thanks for being with us. I believe we are going to have an interesting and insightful session because we have the privilege of having Stephen King with us one more time in a month. It's the second time, actually. So welcome, Stephen.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So we have a relatively short time to speak about inflation, around 30 minutes. We would love to take some, questions if we finish on time, hopefully, from the audience. So I want to jump right into the questions, if I may. As in the title of your latest book, I think we need to talk about inflation today, Stephen. So my first question is, when we look at the earlier days of the pandemic, we see that seemingly the market expectations were wrong about inflation and deflation scenarios, and apparently inflation is back, and it's a global issue. And there's so much talk about the global shock of inflation around the world, all around the world, but the country experiences have been extremely different. So can you walk us through what has happened so far?
Yeah, so first of all, if I take your minds back to, let's say, 2019, so the year before the pandemic hit, much of the Western developed world was faced with deflation rather than inflation, the world where inflation was too low rather than too high, where interest rates were at rock bottom. And there was a lot of discussion about the sort of Japanification of Western economies. And the idea that inflation could possibly return was almost unimaginable. And then the pandemic comes along, and inflation starts to surprise on the upside. And when you look at the beginning of 2021, which is a year into the pandemic, you're seeing upside surprises to inflation in the US, first of all, and then shortly afterwards in the Eurozone and the UK. So this was odd because economic activity had collapsed, and normally you think that very low economic activity is associated with very low inflation, but here we had inflation beginning to rise. And when it did rise, it was very easy to explain it away, that people said, it's all to do with the pandemic, about supply-side shortages that would rectify themselves relatively quickly. It was all associated a year later with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impact that came through in 2022 on energy prices and then food prices. But I'd like to argue that something else was at work as well. And that something else was the fact that in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, central banks around the world loosened monetary policy on a scale that we hadn't really seen before. And one way you can capture that is through the way in which the growth of money supply went completely through the roof. So in 2020, the numbers in the US in particular were incredibly strong, suggesting that there was a sort of extraordinary attempt to sort of restart economies through monetary stimulus. And the numbers also in the Eurozone and the UK were very, very buoyant. So you had this monetary stimulus. Why did central banks do it? Because they were terrified of a kind of repeat of the Great Depression in the 1930s. They thought that given the collapse in economic activity that was taking place, that we could be on the verge of another kind of terrible deflationary shock. But unlike the Great Depression, there were no multiple bank failures, no mass bankruptcies, no mass unemployment, no continuous declines in asset prices. In fact, quite the opposite. Asset prices rose strongly in the second half of 2020 and then carried on rising thereafter. So even though the economies were weak, people's financial wealth in many cases was actually rising pretty swiftly. So you were building up a sort of momentum of potential higher spending, which couldn't happen immediately because of lockdowns, but when lockdowns came to an end and people were able to spend freely, they absolutely did. So demand picks up strongly, supply is still very weak, and at that point, inflation itself begins to accelerate much more rapidly than people had expected. Now, where we are today is interesting because you've got very different inflationary experiences depending on where you look. You've got some countries like Turkey that have perennially had problems with inflation. You've got countries like China that have had no inflation whatsoever. And I think is interesting because China, unlike the US, unlike the Eurozone, unlike the UK, did not loosen monetary policy aggressively in 2020. They were terrified of a repeat of the property bubble that had been a problem for them in previous years, so they didn't offer the same kind of monetary stimulus. And then when you look at the US, the Eurozone, the UK, even there you can see differences that have now emerged. And the main difference is that the Federal Reserve spotted in late 2021 that inflation was now a problem. You may recall that Jay Powell, the chair of the Fed, the president of the Fed, abolished the word transitory. He said, no, inflation is not transitory anymore, we've got a problem with it. And thereafter, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates very, very quickly to much higher levels than anyone had anticipated. Whereas if I take my own central bank, the Bank of England was reluctant to admit that there was any lasting inflation problem until earlier this year. And the difference is that whereas the Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively through 2021 and beyond, Bank of England was a sort of reluctant tightener of monetary policy. It didn't really push it very far. And one difference, therefore, is that in the US, inflation has fallen back quite some way. It's still too high, but it has fallen back. Whereas in the UK's case, not only has inflation remained quite high, but there's more evidence of so-called second-round effects. In other words, that wage growth in the UK is now running at about 8% year on year, which might seem low by Turkish standards, but by sort of Western developed economy standards, it's very, very high, and it's not really consistent with a return to price stability at any point soon. So I think we sort of ended up with differences in terms of inflationary outcomes, but the general picture is one where inflation is higher than you would like it to be, and moreover, the cost of fighting it is much higher than people had expected because interest rates are so much higher than people might have anticipated a year or 2 years ago. So things have changed a long way over the last 2 or 3 years.
Thanks, Stephen. That's a nice way of setting the context. And, even though it came with a lag, central banks reacted and very harshly, aggressively in a way. But when we look at it, we see core inflation in many countries like US is still higher than the headline.
Yeah.
Which should be the other way around in normal cases. Do you think we will go back to normal, or will there be a new normal?
Well, let me tell you something. I used to work at Her Majesty's Treasury, now His Majesty's Treasury in the UK, but basically the Ministry of Finance in the UK in the late 1980s. This is going back quite some time. And there was a debate at the time because in the UK you had wage growth at the time running at about 8% year on year, and you had inflation having dropped a long way. It was down to about 3.5%. And the debate back then was, would wages determine future inflation, or would current inflation determine future wages? And there were optimists and pessimists in terms of what would happen to inflation over the following few years. What is fair to say is that the big declines we've seen in headline inflation over the last few months owe a lot to what's happened in global energy markets, owe a lot to the restoration of gas supplies in parts of Europe, which was suffering previously, and in some cases owe something to a reversal of earlier food price inflation. So these are all pieces of good news from the perspective of commodity-consuming countries around different parts of the world. But at the same time, you have got this growing evidence of what I describe as sticky core inflation. And the reason for that is partly that if you're a wage earner and you've experienced the kind of loss of real income over the last 2 or 3 years, and the central bank's promised much lower inflation has actually been achieved, you're getting to the point now of saying, well, hang on, I've lost so much in terms of my spending power, I want something back. I want something back in return. And so you're seeing in different parts of the world a higher level of labor unrest than we've seen in decades. You can see this in the US. The number of industrial disputes in the US is the highest it's been in decades. You can see it particularly in the UK public sector, where you're seeing a huge increase in strike action over the last few months. And what this suggests is that inflation has returned as a kind of narrative, as an idea of people to talk about. There was a central banker famously was asked a few years back, how do you define price stability? How do you define a world of no inflation? And the person who asked the question was expecting a very technical answer. But the answer that was actually given was very simple. He said that you have price stability when it's simply not worth talking about inflation. That people don't need to talk about it because if inflation is running at 1%, 2%, it just doesn't matter. It's not important. It's not relevant in terms of how you think about your wage increase, your price increase from one year to the next. It just doesn't bother you. But when inflation's up at 3%, 4%, 5%, it becomes part of the narrative. And once it's part of the narrative, and once it sort of feeds through into our psychology, then letting go of it is difficult. Also, when inflation's higher, more volatile, there's a greater sense of unfairness associated with inflation. So think about it this way. My next-door neighbor gets a pay increase in January, and my next-door neighbor buys a nice new car thanks to the pay increase. And my pay increase isn't due to come along until, say, July. In the intervening period, the central bank is saying, we're going to stop inflation. So what the central bank needs is for me to forego my wage increase, because that will help to bring inflation down. But I personally am thinking, well, why should I go without my wage increase when my next-door neighbor had one 6 months ago and has bought a new car with their wage increase? So the problem here is that when you have overlapping contracts, when some people get the wage settlement in January and some in July and some people, I don't know, in September, then actually stopping inflation once it started becomes difficult because it's there in the psychology of people, how they think about what is a fair wage, what's a fair price increase, what's reasonable. And this raises, I think, a lesson from previous episodes of inflation, which is that once it's established, stopping it becomes that much more difficult. Because once it's established in people's minds, you have to change people's minds. And changing people's minds typically requires high interest rates, a severe slowing of the economy, unfortunately sometimes an increase in unemployment, none of which you really want, but which historically have been costs associated with trying to get rid of inflation once it's established.
Yeah, I think, it makes sense. The people in this room will understand more what you mean, how
more so than I do, I think, actually.
Deteriorates the future expectations, how people talk about day and day more about inflation when things get worse. So we feel it here. So when we look at it, the spike all around the world in inflation and the aggressive rate hiking cycle by central banks, I just wonder how you compare it to the experience in the 70s, early 70s, what we lived there.
Yes. So at the beginning of the 1970s, there's a kind of popular narrative today which many people share. And the popular narrative is that the quadrupling of oil prices in 1973, interesting, again, associated with the war in the Middle East, of course, was the factor that led to the high inflation of the 1970s. And there's a sort of a mythology now that says that it all came about as a consequence of this external shock. And it kind of plays into the idea that inflation only occurs because of external shocks and for no other reason. That mythology is wrong. It's wrong because inflation in the US was rising in the late 1960s and then continuing to accelerate all the way through the early 1970s. And I would suggest that the inflationary shock associated with the oil price increases in 1973 It's like the icing on an already inflationary cake. It was not the cause of the inflation. What was the cause? Effectively, it was a story about loosening monetary conditions at a time of tremendous fiscal pressure. So bigger and bigger budget deficits, accompanied by looser and looser monetary policy. It was associated, particularly in the US, with a kind of breakdown of the monetary order as it used to be. The Bretton Woods system of exchange rates collapsed at the beginning of the 1970s. And part of this was a story associated with the costs of funding the Vietnam War from a US perspective, which proved to be very expensive. It was also associated with Lyndon B. Johnson's big society aims of the late 1960s, which involved very, very significant, large budget deficits. Now, the reason why this is relevant today is that we today are living in a similar world of what had been relatively loose monetary conditions, but at the same time, very large amounts of government borrowing. Now, a lot of economists say, well, what the government does in terms of borrowing and what the central bank does in terms of interest rates, they're two separate things that never, ever come together. But again, in my research for the book, the idea that fiscal and monetary policy are separate at all times, it's nonsense. They eventually come together. And when a government has large amounts of debt and is running out of fiscal space to deal with that high level of debt, you can't raise taxes very easily for political reasons, or it can't cut public spending for political reasons, there is always an incentive to create inflation. Because inflation effectively is the debtor's friend. Inflation reduces the real value of nominal debts. Of course, it's the creditor's enemy. The lender loses out from inflation, but the debtor, the borrower, tends to benefit. And if it turns out that the government itself is the biggest borrower, then in those circumstances, there's every chance you might find that inflation begins to come back. Now, I mention this today because I'll give you some numbers which are, I think, relevant for where we are at the moment. If I take my country, the UK is fortunate. It has a very, very long-run history of fiscal data going back over 300 years. And normally, when government debt rises rapidly relative to the size of the economy, that happens during wartime. So in the UK's case, it happened during the Napoleonic Wars. It happened during the First World War. It happened during the Second World War. The only other occasion when government debt has risen as rapidly as it did during those wartime periods is the last 15 years. Starting with the global financial crisis, the costs of that huge crisis, followed by the cost of COVID. And what is true of the UK is also true of the majority of other Western developed nations. So here we are living with huge increases in debt over the last 15 years, government debt. Now, projections for the future suggest that these large amounts of government debt will get still larger. And the reason for that is partly associated with aging populations. That what was true of Japan is going to be true for the US, Canada, most of Europe over the course of the next 30 or 40 years. And the official bodies that make these kinds of projections suggest that government debt will rise much further in the years to come. Now, I'm going to suggest that in many cases, governments have now run out of room to raise taxes much further. Politically, it's difficult to do that. They can't easily cut public spending because so much of it is pre-committed, particularly because of population aging, but also now because of the costs of the green transition, the costs of probably higher defense spending, given what's been happening in the world over the last couple of years. All these things are going to add to spending pressures. So if you've got runaway spending, you've got limited tax increases, what else can you do? Well, there are limitations. You can default, but no one wants to default. You can indulge in so-called financial repression, where you basically drive interest rates down below the market clearing level to allow governments to borrow more cheaply. You can do this through banking regulation, for example. The problem with that is it's quite difficult to do it sustainably without capital controls, and no one wants to return to capital controls. Or you simply create inflation. And so I think we have moved into a world whereby the incentive to tolerate inflation is greater than it has been for many, many decades. So I'm not suggesting we're going to have a sudden announcement to say inflation targets have gone up. But what I think we will find is that year after year, we'll discover that inflation's been higher than target, and year after year, central banks will find an excuse for why that's happened. But actually, we'll discover, as the years go by, that actually the targets themselves are not met, and we have continuous overshoots over a sustained period of time.
Well, yes, Stephen, I mean, that's a good summary of what's going on in the world, especially in the Western world. But I wonder what's going on in Japan, for example. So probably the only country with negative policy rates still.
Yes.
And we see, some, inflation there after decades of deflation. So, and we heard this week, Bank of Japan considering flexible rates of purchase of, JGBs, removing the cap on 1% for 10 years. So what will be the sort of, actions there if they face similar inflation issues?
So Japan, of course, has had very low inflation accompanying its very high levels of government debt. It's been partly helped by the Bank of Japan's actions over the last few decades. I mean, they started quantitative easing long before everyone else did, and that's helped to keep bond yields lower. But alongside that has been this idea that inflation itself is at rock bottom, that it's always too low rather than too high. I would suggest that the situation currently is the first time in decades where the Bank of Japan is suddenly faced with a bit of a dilemma. Inflation has moved higher. Dealing with inflation alone would require higher interest rates. But the problem for Japan is that higher interest rates would make it more difficult to sustain the now very high levels of government debt. In other words, what you need to do in terms of tackling inflation is exactly the opposite of what you need to do to sustain the government's fiscal position. So I think the Bank of Japan is hoping and praying that inflation will automatically drop back down again over the next few months, because if it doesn't, if inflation were to become more clearly established domestically, then it's caught in a terrible, terrible dilemma. Does it raise interest rates to stop inflation, or does it not raise interest rates to keep the fiscal numbers adding up? And oddly, it raises an intriguing risk. It's not part of my central forecast, but it raises an intriguing risk that if it turns out that the Bank of Japan can't easily raise interest rates because of the fiscal consequences of doing it, Japan could switch from being the country with the lowest inflation rate for many years to suddenly becoming the country with a rather high inflation rate, because the linkage between monetary policy and fiscal policy makes it much more difficult for the Bank of Japan to act to deal with a growing inflationary problem. Now, hopefully we won't get there, but ask me again in a year or 2 years' time, and we'll have a better idea as to how much that risk has grown over that period.
I understand. So, Stephen, we understood where we came from, and we just wonder where we're heading to. So, looking forward, do you think central banks learned their lessons? Do you think 2% inflation target is still realistic for US or Western world? And what are the implications on emerging markets, maybe, just to wrap it up?
So first of all, I think most central banks are concerned that although inflation has come down, it's still rather sticky. I mean, this is the message that the Federal Reserve gave just a few hours ago, basically. It's the message that's come from the ECB. It's been the message coming through from the Bank of England. So inflation's come down, that's welcome. Has it returned convincingly to 2%? No. So that tells you, first of all, that the fight against inflation is going to be there for quite a long time. So higher for longer is probably a useful phrase to think about with regard to levels of interest rates over coming months and quarters. Secondly, when it comes to inflation outlook, again, my sense is that central banks are afraid of throwing economies into recession, so they will try to keep inflation limited, but I'm not sure they'll drive it down enough to get it back to the kinds of conditions we had prior to the pandemic. So I think inflation is likely to be surprising on the upside rather than the downside over the course of the months and quarters ahead. So higher rates and higher inflation we've been used to for really quite some time. As for emerging markets, there's a huge range of different outcomes. So China has not really had any kind of significant inflation problem. Brazil, which traditionally has had big inflation problems, was very early in raising interest rates aggressively, is now cutting interest rates, appears to be at the forefront of dealing with an inflation problem that might have been bigger. And then, of course, you've got countries like Turkey that have very different kinds of inflation experiences from most other countries, and where the inflation is a much bigger sort of embedded problem than we've seen elsewhere. And that's going to take a bit harder work, I think, to get rid of.
So I just wonder, what's your view on Turkey? Obviously, we will come to that. We won't let you without having your views on Turkey. You recently met our Minister Şimşek, and you had some impressions on this. So what's your take on Turkey? You know, policy actions, normalization efforts?
So I want to refer to not so much Turkey today, but countries that have had high inflation in the past and what they've done to get rid of it. And there's a famous academic paper that was written many, many years ago by a guy called Tom Sargent, who won the Nobel Prize afterwards. And he examined 4 what he described as hyperinflations of the 1920s and 1930s. And what he observed was that these countries had very high inflation rates, and then almost immediately, through some extreme policy changes, the inflation rates disappeared. And what he wanted to examine was what happened in these countries that allowed the inflation that had been so embedded to disappear within the relatively short space of time. And there were a few things that were in common for all these countries. So the first thing was make the central bank completely independent. The second thing was to pass a law to prevent any kind of monetization of government debt. In other words, the central bank was not allowed to print money to help fund government borrowing. And the third policy that was adopted by all these countries was that government debt, fiscal policy, had to be put on a sustainable medium-term path. In other words, that there was a commitment to reducing the government debt-GDP ratio over a long period of time, but you couldn't do it simply by printing money. You had to do it either by raising taxes or cutting public spending or finding ways of boosting productivity or whatever might be the case. Now, what is striking about all the episodes, and this refers to Weimar Germany of the 1920s, it refers to examples from Hungary, Poland, I think Austria was the 4th example. In all these countries, the announcement effect of these legal changes and these political commitments was very, very significant. And people understood that the rules of the game had changed. And by changing the rules of the game, people's inflationary expectations came down very, very quickly. Yeah. So it is possible to do it, but it does require, A, a lot of willpower, B, a lot of political commitment, and C, a recognition that the monetary and fiscal authorities have to be completely independent from one another. And achieving all these things, you know, it's fine on paper, but in reality it can be quite tricky. So that's what historically would need to happen.
No hint for future, you say. Look at history, and so
yes.
we can be pessimistic about what's going on in Turkey, but you know, we can be optimistic. Sorry, I'm correcting myself, but we need to see the consistency and the will, as you say. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching to the end of our session, considering the time given to us. So it's time to take a couple of questions, sure, if we can, if there's any. And mikrofonumuz var diye düşünüyorum, değil mi? There is one.
Is there a microphone
behind? Yeah.
No.
We need microphones.
Oh, here we go.
Thanks for coming to Turkey. My name is Murat. Just want to ask you a very basic question. Do you believe inflation of today, or consequences happening, just a result or intention to drive another world war? That's my question, basically. I mean, the main intention, I believe, it's a new world order. Something to change, to even start with this pandemic, the inflation which is affecting all economics. And I don't think that none of central banks are really independent, and none of economies are independent. I mean, is there any particular things that nations can do something to change this whole infrastructure again, when the cards are, currently handling again? And I mean, my feeling that we are like something 1930s. We're expecting the Second World War. Are you agree on this, which is related the economics and the politics?
Well, first of all, I sincerely hope there isn't going to be a Third World War. Secondly, I think there are some marked differences with the 1930s. Remember, the 1930s were associated with deflation rather than inflation. But it is worth noting that I think there has certainly been a change in the international order relative to what had been true 20 or 30 years ago. I'm going to shamelessly advertise my previous book, which was called Grave New World. This came out in 2017, but the subtitle was The End of Globalization and the Return of History. In hindsight, the book seems to have worked rather too well, perhaps. But what I'd like to argue is this, that we lived through the last 20 or 30 years a period of what you might describe as hyper-globalization, where borders and barriers came down in different parts of the world, and we had a much greater degree of economic integration in goods markets, services markets, capital markets. All these things changed a long way. And alongside those changes, particularly for the Western developed world, it became possible to import cheaper and cheaper goods made by people in low labor cost areas elsewhere in the world. And that created what I describe as a sort of deflationary tailwind. It meant that inflation was lower for any given growth rate in the States or in Europe than might otherwise have been the case. I would argue that even before the pandemic, that story was going into reverse, particularly the deteriorating relationship between Washington and Beijing. Partly a story about the rebuilding of borders and barriers associated with the return of populism of one kind or another. I mean, in my own country, Brexit in one sense is a kind of populist response by people in the UK, but it's definitely rebuilt borders and barriers between the UK and the EU that hadn't been there previously. So that has been a noticeable change. And I think post-pandemic, there's much more talk about building national resilience, shortening global supply chains, going towards reshoring or nearshoring. So for all these reasons, I think you've shifted from having a deflationary tailwind to an inflationary headwind. Now, I would strongly suggest this is not really, it wasn't an intentional part of the story. I don't think there's a grand plan to create more inflation. But I think more inflation has been the result of these changes, an unexpected, unintended result perhaps. And alongside that, given the deterioration that we've seen coming through in fiscal positions, which has been enormous over the last 20 or 30 years, that deterioration historically is consistent with the greater tolerance of inflation than there would have been the case previously. So I'm not sure there's a grand plan to create inflation, but I think that inflation is a natural consequence of changes that have happened elsewhere, particularly changes in political economy around the world and that rebuilding of borders and barriers.
So we can take one more question if there's any in the room. I guess not. So that's the end of our session. Stephen, thank you very much. To me, it was very useful. I think it was the same for the audience. Bizi dinlediğiniz için teşekkür ederiz.